This episode goes live the morning of Election Day 2024, and for those who are listening in the far-off future, it may come across as too little, too late. See, it's a argument that begins with a metaphor, and it's an argument that is intended on asking, what is this all for to begin with? See, we're getting ready for an election where this is America. There's all these questions about the rights of the citizens to bear arms. There's preparations for the potential of violence. And all of these conversations continue to run somehow directly in line with the kinds of problems that are plaguing the country, especially young men. See, for those who want some sort of hard and fast answer, like it's the communists or the Democrats or the Republicans or the libertarians or the insert such forms of argumentation below, the thing that we're going to realize, and I think the thing that I want to illustrate, is the way that we treat reality itself. This subject has come up a couple times before. It has been a subject that I've not only seen as an element of the inspiration of this channel, but also a problem that I've witnessed in the lives of so many people, particularly young men. The story goes, and you may have heard it before, that many of us who got out of the military were expecting that the transition was going to be quite difficult. We were expecting to not be connected to a brotherhood or a community. We were going to struggle to find some sense of order in a new world of chaos. We didn't have deployments to distract us from things like bills and taxes. We didn't have urgent concerns, this sense of urgency in itself, to easily organize our set of priorities. See, it's not hard to think about what you have to do when the hierarchy of values before you, or the ranking structure of responsibilities, allows you to prioritize things like the urgency of a deployment over something much more ambiguous. But if I want to try a bit more of a, let's call it a out of left field approach, it would be to talk about how recently my wife and I went to a mining town in the rural West, and that town was decorated with goblins and witches and all these kind of Halloween-y activities. They had ghost tours and things about how they were talking about the spiritual world, and there were occasional iconography of mediums and the occult and so on and so forth. But ultimately, no matter how hard you looked at it, it didn't really seem like the decorations were intended to imply something real. It's like painting your entire wall with a mural, only for that mural to be an argument of what it could be like if you lived in an enchanted world. The idea of an enchanted world is not exactly new. I am by no means the originator of it. But if you were to reach into the philosophy of Charles Taylor, and you were to look back through history, perhaps before the French Revolution, and even before then, you would see, before even a lot of the Enlightenment, in fact, you would see that people at least wrote and spoke in some sense as if there was an order to the world, even if it was an order that they could not directly perceive with their own eyes. That there were things that happened, that there were spirits and ghosts and things like that, or there were explanations for things that weren't so simple. To quote C.S. Lewis and talk about chronological snobbery, the contemporary world seems to think that because we have access to more information, we are also simultaneously more capable of evaluating it. And this would be a fundamental epistemic flaw, whether it's talking about being able to look like a ranger but not do ranger things, or wear the cries and the fancy plate carriers, but when it comes down to doing the job, there's just nothing there. This is a direct correlation into the gun culture, as we find people who fake about who they are, oddly distasteful, whether it's as overt as stolen valor or it is as subtle as sort of the airsofty, well, what used to be the criticism thrown at a lot of airsofters, but the kind of the fake commando, the person who has all the gear and knows all the terms for all the things, but if you were to ask him, or if he were to be called to the circumstances, there's nobody there who believes that he will be up to the task. what we're talking about here is perception versus reality, not perception as reality. It's not an easy frame to talk about. In fact, we're talking about, again, we're on the cusp of an election, and we are all waiting with bated breath about what is going to be the outcome and to what extent we're even going to believe it when it arrives. And that raises an odd question. That raises an illustrated point on what we actually believe is real. See, the postmodern era is infected almost every aspect of the Western world by distilling all of reality to something that is mere perception. And some people have chosen to become wise enough at it, or perhaps are conveniently labeled in that situation, raised in that scenario, and they are looking at perception being reality as something that they can manipulate, because if they can manipulate your perception, then they will manipulate your reality. Who is the infamous they in this question should be an easy question to answer, but instead so much of our time has been consumed by disposing of any individual responsibility in a world of so-called threats and non-threats to the infamous they, whether it is the three brackets they of some sort of social media joke, or it is the they of the media, the they of the shadowy organizations, the CIA, the FBI, the deep state, or whatever it is. And it's odd that we approach something as human as an organization like the CIA or the FBI as if they were some sort of mystical force. It's almost like we have abolished the enchantment of the world that was before, only to replace it with a new enchantment, where instead of it being a spirit or a demon of some sorts, instead it is a man with a tie in a cubicle far, far away. And this topic, whether it relates to your life in gun culture, or this topic, whether it relates to ideas of plausible deniability and the potential of civil war, is meant to perhaps give you some of the intellectual tools to look at some of the conflicts that we are currently facing and may very well face in the future. And that being said, this is actually a sponsored podcast, and so allow me to put on that hat and make the statement. It is Obsidian Arms who has been the first to come in and support this show. They are a firearms and manufacturing company that has many of the aspects of gun culture under lock. Whether it's manufacturing parts, many of them that you might find in your gun safe, or providing tools, ones that come with a lifetime warranty, to better further your ability to be self-sustaining. If you're looking at some sort of professional arena of gunsmithing, you might want to check out their toolkits, whether it's for the AR-15 or just a simple and reliable punch kit. Or you can head over to you can head over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com if you have been designing something that you need manufactured that you want to bring to market. So how do I phrase this? I mean, I spoke earlier last week about trying to get back in the saddle. There's been weeks of fog, whether it's brain fog or cultural mud to try to slog through. There's been questions of direction and objectivity. And ultimately, I want to start with the idea of civil war. Now, whether it's the talking point of Tim Pool or later, more lately, Rudyard Lynch, and you want to look at what we think about when we talk about civil war, unfortunately, yet also simultaneously to our advantage, most of those who I assume are listening to this show have come to some understanding that civil war in the United States of the West is not going to look at all like something that comes out of a von Clausewitz era warfare. See, von Clausewitz is a historian. He was a kind of a philosopher of war, if you want to go that direction, who in many ways set much of the paradigm for our current era. And a paradigm is a term that we get most likely from Thomas Kuhn, who talked about the structure of scientific revolutions as not so much of a continual climb towards a single objective, but something like a collection of generally assumed beliefs that served as the foundation for an era. And then that collection of generally assumed beliefs, something like Newtonian physics or Einsteinian physics or something or so on and so forth, a pretty commonly held worldview when it came to the material world, oftentimes would collect enough anomalies, enough things challenging the legitimacy of that paradigm until culturally it collapsed. And if we were to compare the structure of scientific revolutions to the French Revolution, what you might say is that the list of grievances between the population and their current existing system at the time in the late 1700s eventually piled on enough grievances that it could no longer sustain the general milieu of its time, the general malaise of the milieu of its time. But see, revolutions are really much more of a contemporary issue. We didn't really start seeing revolutions in their language come around as much, with exceptions, and you could retroactively describe certain things as revolutions. Perhaps even Julius Caesar led a revolution against the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic at the time, by overturning its current functioning operating system with something new. But I'd illustrate the French Revolution specifically because of how the way that we have been thinking about warfare is currently undergoing, and I would say is more in the late stages of the collapse of the von Clausewitz era. It wouldn't be right to condemn von Clausewitz, and it wouldn't even be effective to say that he had an insufficient description of how warfare functioned, because he was working in the time that he existed. He was working in a time where most warfare was between governments. And it was very overt, and there was intent to limit it between the actions between governments, and those governments were also in some ways somewhat isolated from their populations, in the way that the decisions that the monarchs and the rulers would make were not always at the behest or the bequest of the population. So then what does it look like when civil war, our current paradigm of civil war, starts to overturn? There are plenty of academics, noteworthy and otherwise, who have addressed the topic to some extent, and we have also seen much of that history drawn out before us with the history of the CIA, the FBI, the OSS, the Jedburghs, the SAS, the rise of special operations, the conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Syria, the types of warfare that we see spreading around the world. Proxy war is not so much of a new idea, but it still implies that there are two sort of empires going to war against each other through proxies so that they don't have to deal with the von Clausewitz complications of war between governments. The Cold War may have never ended, or maybe it just took a nap sometime. Maybe it warmed up a little bit and we all got busy with the technological revolution through the internet and cell phones and so on and so forth. But what we're looking at when we're looking at civil war in our age is that we already intuitively know and seem to understand somewhat responsibly that the idea of a civil war in the United States is very much so not going to look like the reds and the blues or the grays and the blues marching against one another, trying to hold cities against each other, because that type of warfare seems to have long passed. I've argued in the past that one of the lead causes for this shift in the way that we even have to look at this concept of warfare is because of the level of munitions capable of attaining. That countries with nukes are really sort of being held not by golden handcuffs, but by a very certain, very real responsibility that if they are going to press that button, that there not only is no going back, but certain mutually assured destruction very likely would be the outcome. Mutually assured destruction is its own deterrent, but it doesn't work against insurgencies. It doesn't work against the guerrillas. It doesn't work against the ways that people, while claiming to wear the face of being your ally, your fellow countrymen, might actually intentionally harm you. Whether it's through economic means, which might beg the question, at what level does the economic actions of an individual or a group or a government become warfare against its own citizens? At what level does the use of culture as an attack vector warrant the title of a form of warfare? We've already seen pundits muddy the language of warfare so much that anything and everything can be considered warfare, which might be the rightish wing version of saying anything or everything can be considered oppression. Have we really reduced our language to something so simplified as if I call it something, then it must be true? And even worse, perhaps more terrifying, like the metaphor at the beginning with the story of the people with the ghost towns, that if we call it something, even though we don't treat it as something, are we still doing the right thing? The challenge about civil war and the way that we collectively and oftentimes culturally talk about conflicts, whether they are actions of self-defense or they are legal actions or whether they are political actions through, well, again, politics and voting and so on and so forth, if we distill everything down to the miasma of warfare, then really nothing is. And therein lies the problem. Do we really treat the conflicts that we believe that we are in like they are real? Do we look at our elections not only as legitimate, but as not as legitimate in the format? No, I'm sorry, not as legitimate in the way that they are executed, whether it's through mail-in voting or through digital systems and physical systems, or have we even forgotten why we think that voting itself might be a legitimate action? Do we really, or have we really moved so far away from the belief that there is some virtue, perhaps responsibility, maybe there is the responsibility of the individual to participate in their political system when we no longer believe that political system represents us? And again, I've raised question after question and challenge after challenge and argument after argument, so let me start to solidify it with this. The way that we know that, or not the way that we know, we already know that the paradigm of the standing armies civil war no longer holds. And there are people who are starting to ask or have been asking for some time on what a future war would look like, especially a civil war in a country as advanced as the United States. And while I may be biased, and while I may have my, let's say, hammer calling everything it sees a nail, I might have that problem on my plate. What we should be expecting is that there are going to be the uses of plausible deniability, which again is a specific term that simply states that a person can benefit from or inspire or instill certain actions without there being the convenient legal chain of them saying, go do this. The best example I think that we have in current contemporary politics of plausible deniability would be the Summer of Love, where you had politicians very clearly call for forms of violence, but they called it in such a way where we all knew what they were saying, but you really had to get wormy to nail it down. It would be, if we do not get justice, then we should bring justice to them, or whatever the current phrase at the time was. And there's plenty of speeches, if you want to go back and find out, about politicians coming to Minnesota and threatening violence sort of abstractly, But we all kind of knew what was going on. We all knew what was happening. And the problem is that if we were going to go and straight out attack that, then we would have to look at all these other issues that are even more abstract, whether it's the illusion of the dog whistling or the whatever you want to talk about in politics, and all of that would dissolve again to this miry mush while we continue to deny the reality that people are calling for overt violence against you and your family, not because you do anything to them, but because you refuse to say yes. You refuse to participate in the farce of their so-called courts. I should speak to this more, but I haven't done it yet. There are a number of speeches in the book Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, and one of the best ones is The Defense by Henry Reardon, where he is on trial for a bogus crime, and he illustrates to the judges, the fake judges, that the only thing that is necessary for them to look legitimate is for the accused to act like the accusation itself is legitimate. But everybody knows that it's a manifested or manipulated, or it's a false accusation created out of thin air for the purpose of control. It's the purpose of damaging the person of Henry Reardon and the virtues that he's supposed to be representing. And that leads to the issue of, do people treat the world as if it is real? One of the challenges that you might run into contemporary politics is that some people have already abdicated their participation in the world that they have some responsibility over, because they claim to look in through the screen, in through their phone, and say, oh, well, it's hopeless in Washington, D.C. I can do nothing in rural Montana. I can have no influence over the people that I have I break daily bread with, because somebody I don't know is playing a dirty trick, pulling wool over my eyes. And this, unfortunately, is, I think, part of the effectiveness of treating, or this is part of the effect, not effectiveness, the effect of treating politics kind of like it's magic or mysticism. Like it's just saying the magic words and getting the numbers on the screen to make you say that we did the thing today. We all know that this idea of virtue signaling is something that we find somewhat morally depraved, that someone could claim some moral character for something that they've never done only because they believe they have the right moral view. It once again looks like the actions of the man who says, because I dress like a seal and talk like a seal and run like a seal and can shoot like a seal, I must be a seal. A Navy SEAL, that is, not the ones that live in the water. Don't go too far with that. And yet we all know the difference between that. We all know the difference between the person who has done the job or does the job, who has done the missions or who has been to battle, and somebody who hasn't, which isn't even really the problem. The problem is not that you haven't done something. It's that people try to subtly convince others that they are a thing that they have not become, or they are a thing that they have not done. Gun culture is, again, oftentimes the context with which these conversations are couched in, and it's strange because it comes up time and time and time again. Or once with the biggest windows of the stolen valor candidates, the people who lie about their military achievements, maybe not even having been in the military themselves. Or there are other examples, whether lying about your grandmaster rank or walking around creating this persona as if you were something which you aren't or haven't been. It's the darkest side of fake it till you make it. And so how that closes off and how that titles into this subject of civil war and the real world and treating the world as if it is real is that so often I observe us look at the world as if our enemies are the ones responsible for defining the circumstances that we're in, while we're not even really going so far as to define who they are. There are cases, an example of something like this that might be an overtly immoral action, where you look at states that have required individual citizens to prove to some court that they attempted to flee their own home before defending their home. Yes, I am looking directly at you, Minnesota, where your court, your government, your politicians have chosen to inhibit the actions of the individual from even defending his life. But the question then is, are we treating this seriously? Who is treating this seriously? If a court is going to go so far, not a court, if a legislature is going to go so far as to punish people for doing what is normal, to prohibit them from doing what is moral, then we should look at that and say, well, that is grounds by which you no longer hold power here. And to some people, it might be the choice to abdicate from public life in certain arenas, or to maybe get a little bit smarter about how you do the things that you do. But ultimately, this is our country, and some people treat it like it is their own, and many people don't. Many people treat their home as if it is their home, or that many people treat other people's homes as if that is their home and themselves, while many of us don't treat our own land like it is our own land, our own country like it is our own country. We treat it like it is sort of it's not even the stewardship, but it is the toy of other people to mess around with, which is a very odd mindset to begin with. And so if I'm going to be that hammer looking at a few nails and thinking of it this way, I think that Rudyard Lynch, if you've listened to What If Alt Hist and talking about the likelihood of civil war in the near future, I haven't caught enough of his material to have an absolute view of, or a complete view of what he thinks it is, but I would like to illustrate, perhaps peel back a little bit of the veil of what that warfare will very likely look like. And the answer is like what it is now. It will be the direct targeting of people who are considered the enemy faction. We still believe, or we still function under a veil of plausible deniability that those who are across the aisle are also somehow with the best interests of the country in mind. This isn't to attack simply political values, because it would be wrong. It would be falling into my own trap to say the infamous they are the Republicans or the Democrats or the libertarians or whatever, but it would be to direct attention to individuals who do specific things. See, if you are responsible for a bill that inhibits people from defending their own lives without having to jump through obscure hoops, then that very well is a data point that illustrates this person with this name and this face has made it so that his own constituents or her own constituents are now subject to violence. And we might want to ask the question of who it is that is most likely to commit said violence. Are you defending those you protect with plausible deniability from the actions of those that you are sending them into attack? If I could take an enemy army or an enemy group of people, somebody that we have already declared war on, and convince them that defending themselves is not only perhaps impossible to do with absolute success, but it itself immoral, then wouldn't I make my conquest so much more easier? See, the civil war of the future is not going to be fought by invisible organizations because they are real, and it's not going to be fought in so much of a way where we expect the marshaling of troops to fight in the battle of, I don't know, pick a Nebraska. I don't know which one you want. But what it will be looking like, and will continue to look like, is that people will follow the history of what I would call, or no, what we might call the special operations world, where individuals are developed and sent off to do things of their own accord. They are going to choose to act, and they are going to make action capable by deliberately targeting things that weaken their opponents and strengthen their own positions. Warfare will continue to be both overt and covert at the same time. The question is, will the difference between overt and covert be definition or perception? This has been the Redacted Culture Cast. Thank you for listening. Leave your comments below. Go forth and conquer.